I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Director of Programs at the American Civil War Museum. If you're not familiar with us, we have 3 locations. Our flagship museum is right here in Richmond, where I am at Historic Tredegar. I've got a photo of our beautiful lobby there behind me. We also operate here in Richmond the White House of the Confederacy, and we have a museum out in Appomattox, Virginia. I'm pleased to welcome you all here tonight for our virtual talk with Ed Lowe, Find Opportunity Lost, James Longstreet's East Tennessee Campaign. And before we get tonight's program underway, I do have some announcements. We always have things going on at the museum. So just a few things that I want you to be aware of. Our next Wind Down Wednesday is going to be July 31st. That's next Wednesday. And it starts about 5:30, runs until 7 p.m. Last month, we focused on 4-legged soldiers. We had some artifacts related to horses. This month, our focus is on cocktails. So we'll be having cocktails Civil War style, a little bit of a presentation on that. And as always, just a wonderful time to hang out at the museum and go through the galleries if you haven't had a chance to visit the museum. So mark your calendars for that next Wednesday. And you can register online at our website, acwm.org. And then the only other thing that I have to announce is next month's virtual book talk. We're taking a little break in programming at Appomattox for the summer. But our next virtual program is August 22nd, 6:30 as always. And we will have Dan Welch and Kevin Pollack, Never Such a Campaign, the Battle of Second Manassas. So be sure and mark your calendars for those things that are coming up. Now for tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest author, Colonel Ed Lowe. He served 26 years on active duty in the U.S. Army with deployments to Operation Desert Shield and Storm, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He attended North Georgia College and has graduate degrees from California State University, the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Command and General Staff College, and Webster's University. He is an adjunct professor for the University of Maryland, the Global Campus, and Elizabethtown College, where he teaches history and government. So welcome. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn the screen over.
Right. Okay, we'll get this going. Go to my slideshow here. And should be good, right, Kelly? Okay, great. Hey, hello everyone from Chattanooga, Tennessee. It is a great honor and privilege to be with you all here tonight. And thank you for Kelly and the American Civil War Museum for hosting this fine event and all the other events that they've hosted. I've been a great fan of this. So you see the first slide here. We are 1 month after Chancellorsville. Army of Northern Virginia is somewhere up in Pennsylvania. And up around before the Battle of Gettysburg takes place there in June, we have a young soldier is conducting guard duty on a key crossroads into a town that the Confederates are holding, again, somewhere up in Pennsylvania. And he has his orders that he is not to allow anybody to enter without a pass. So he's a young soldier. He's vigilant, determined in his duties. I mean, he's going to carry out those duties to the best of his ability. Well, approaching him is a young Confederate captain. He's coming down the road, and he is beyond the limits of curfew, and he doesn't have a valid pass. So he's kind of questioning how am I going to get past this soldier without a pass. He kind of rubs his chin a little bit, scratches his head, and pulls some papers out of his uniform, and comes up with a piece of paper that he knows will do the trick. And so he approaches the young centennial confidently, hands the piece of paper to the young soldier, and the young soldier looks at it rather quizzically because it is signed by the late Stonewall Jackson, who had been killed the month before. So he scratches his head, and he's not sure what to do with this. And then finally decides this is how I'm going to handle this. And he gives the piece of paper back to the captain and says, "Sir, you may be able to get to heaven with this pass, but you will not pass my post." So, but we're not here to talk about Stonewall Jackson or the Gettysburg campaign. We're here to talk about these two gentlemen here, James Longstreet and Ambrose Burnside, who commanded the Army of the Ohio. And then you see in the lower left-hand part, the lower right-hand part of the map, kind of the area of operations that we'll be talking about from Chattanooga to Campbell Station to Knoxville and beyond, going up to Bristol. This is the outline I'll be following. And I have given many a tours at Chickamauga Battlefield. And many of those who come down and have really focused interest on the Eastern Theater are really surprised and shocked to find James Longstreet in North Georgia. And we go through that, and time again, that will often be the question. We of course see Longstreet in Gettysburg, and then to many he just appears for the start of the Overland campaign in May of '64 in the Battle of the Wilderness. Well, during that time period, he spent a good deal of his time in North Georgia and Tennessee, Chattanooga, and into East Tennessee, and that's really going to be the focus of some of the things we're going to be looking at today. When you see here the outline. Some of the takeaways, 3 takeaways I want you to kind of remember as you leave out of here is Longstreet's command challenges during his time in East Tennessee. Now, many people will look at the Army of Tennessee that was commanded by Braxton Bragg, and will rightly so say he had his challenges as well with his own command structure and some of his commanders, Leonidas Polk, for example, Thomas Hyman, and a few others. But Longstreet has some challenges as well as he ventured into East Tennessee. We look at the redemption, possibly, of Ambrose Burnside. Very familiar, the study of the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, the famous Mud March a month later. And maybe his reputation was somewhat tarnished. But he had taken command of the Army of the Ohio, had come down from Kentucky, and had seized Knoxville in September of 1863. And we're going to see how he most likely got some of his reputation back with his actions, his tactical and operational decisions against Longstreet. And we're going to be talking about those throughout the presentation. And the environment matters. We look at supplies, look at logistics, and we certainly can't discount the weather that played a big factor in these operations for both the North and the South during the time in East Tennessee, especially when the cold winter days of 1864 struck Knoxville and beyond pretty heavily. Task organization, James Longstreet, South Carolinian, raised in Georgia. His mother lived in Alabama, and he gained his West Point appointment through the representatives in Alabama. And he graduated in 1842. His good friend, U.S. Grant, graduated a year later, and he was, for a brief period of time, a roommate of William Rosecrans, who commanded the U.S. Army of the Cumberland during the Chickamauga and part of the Chattanooga campaign. But, he had no state affiliation, my friends. You look at Robert E. Lee, for example, and Virginia kind of embraced him as their own. Longstreet did not have that luxury, that privilege, I guess. Have Lafayette McLaws, who commanded. It was one of the corps, of course, and familiar. If you go back to the Battle of Gettysburg, example, was a lifelong friend of Longstreet. Was also a West Point graduate. And we have Evander Law and Micah Jenkins, both born in South Carolina, both graduated from what is now the Citadel. Jenkins taught at the Kings Mountain Military Academy. Jenkins outranked Law by a number of months, and One of the things we're going to be taking a look at tonight is this battle for command of Hood's division. We all know Hood was wounded on July 2nd, that Thursday, and he was wounded once again at the Battle of Chickamauga on September 20th, 1863, and then command fell to the division to Evander Law. But then Micah Jenkins comes in, and there's going to be a struggle for that command of the division for a period of weeks and months, and that does have a real negative effect on Longstreet's command in East Tennessee. And of course, George Pickett is too beaten up from the Battle of Gettysburg to participate. And I mentioned John Bell Hood. Into East Tennessee, he ventured also with 2 battalions of artillery from Edward Porter Alexander and 2 cavalry divisions, 4 small cavalry brigades under Joseph Wheeler. He would take into East Tennessee with him. And of course, the Army of the Ohio. Look, about 26,000 strong as of the end of October. 2 corps, Robert Potter commanding the 9th, and you see the 23rd Corps there. His 8,000 cavalry was under the command of General Shackelford. That's kind of what was stacked up during the campaign as we prepared for. And we look at Chattanooga, and I will go over this very briefly. Of course, we had the Battle of Chickamauga, 1819, 20 September, 1863. William Rosecrans of the Army of the Cumberland withdraws into Chattanooga itself, and a partial siege takes place by Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee. And that goes on, and they're strangling Rosecrans' supply operations. Food and supplies are not coming into Chattanooga. And eventually, at some point in mid-October, a gentleman named General U.S. Grant comes into Chattanooga as commander of the newly minted military division of Mississippi that has 3 armies under his control: the Army of the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee. So he arrives, and Chattanooga had replaced Rosecrans with George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and slowly begins to commence operations to open up what he called the cracker line, the supply line, which he does. We have the Battle of Brown's Ferry on October 27th, just shortly after Grant had arrived in Chattanooga. That opens up this supply line, begin to flow into Chattanooga itself. And then a few days later, a couple days later, on the 29th of October, Longstreet hatches a plan for a night operation at the outpost of Wauhatchie, which is not far from Brown's Ferry. And that doesn't go as well as they, both Bragg and Longstreet would have liked. And there was a lot of consternation between Bragg and his commanders, as I had mentioned. Longstreet became part of that, so much so that Jeff Davis, the president of the Confederacy, came into Chattanooga in the second week of October and had to sit down with all the commanders to try and assuage some of the ill feelings that were going on. When he left a few days later, this is what he told the Army and the commanders. He said, quote, "To zeal you have added gallantry, to gallantry energy, to energy fortitude, crown these with harmony, due subordination, and cheerful support to lawful authority, that the measure of your duty may be full." Somewhat of a slight admonishment, you could say, to maybe some of Bragg's senior commanders and the soldiers itself. But he keeps Bragg in command, and the Army of Tennessee goes on. But yet, as the Battle of Wauhatchie was closing down and October fell into November, Jeff Davis and Braxton Bragg have a conversation about possibly sending James Longstreet with some cavalry up to counter Burnside's Army of the Ohio in Knoxville, threatening their flank. Bragg was, I think, more than willing and very glad to rid himself of Longstreet. As a matter of fact, Donald Stoker, who wrote the great book, The Grand Design, said, quote, "Bragg wasted no time in sending Longstreet on his way, and Longstreet wasted no time in going." So Longstreet and in his 2 divisions of McLaws and Micah Jenkins, cavalry and artillery, they head out. Writing on the Army of Tennessee, Stanley Horn wrote, quote, "Could a seasoned soldier like Bragg fail to realize the folly of dividing his forces in the face of an ever strong enemy? Was he willing to almost do anything to get rid of Longstreet? And apparently he was. For Bragg's instructions to Longstreet were very clear, my friends. He was to make rapid movements and sudden blows. Many would say that this was Longstreet's independent command. I would argue that it was not, at least not initially, because Bragg had told Longstreet, I may have to recall you in the case of an emergency. So I think initially he was still under Bragg's control. Keep communications between Longstreet and Bragg's headquarters. Of course, General Grant, I'm sure you've heard this quote before, as he looked at this, said on several occasions during the war, he, Jeff Davis, came to the relief of the Union Army by means of his superior military genius. And so, certainly, I think he looked at this decision to send Longstreet up to Knoxville as part of that decision-making process that Jeff Davis had. He saw it as a mistake. So we have here again, head north up towards Knoxville, a place called Sweetwater, and then Loudon, and then, of course, Knoxville. Now, in the second week of November, as they had moved out of Chattanooga, there are some very interesting correspondence that take place between Braxton Bragg and James Longstreet in terms of logistics. And they're going back and forth about who has responsibility for supplying Longstreet's men, getting them proper forage, supplies, etc. And this is one of the quotes. And this is where I came up with the title of my book here. But with the force that I now have, I think it would be unreasonable to expect much. In fact, it will, in all probability, be another fine opportunity loss. He sends this to Braxton Bragg on the 11th. So he's kind of prophetically looking forward, saying, I don't think there's much going to come out of this, and I'm very concerned. The very next day, Braxton Bragg responds back to Longstreet on this missive here. And you can read what he says there. Your several dispatches of today astonish me. And it's certainly very much an admonishment of Longstreet from Bragg and his headquarters saying, you know, this is your command. You are responsible for that. To this, on November 12th, Longstreet responded, you are very much mistaken in supposing that any authority over transportation has ever been extended to me. I have several times made known to you our delays, and your dispatch just received is the first intimation that I could exercise any such authority. So, my friends, it is already off to a very rocky start coming out of Chattanooga in early November of 1864. Writing in his memoirs, Longstreet says, quote, his effort to make his paper record at my expense was not pleasing, but I tried to endure with patience. He knew that trains and conductors were under his exclusive control, but he wanted papers that would throw the responsibility of delay on another's shoulders. And Longstreet simply concluded this was more of a campaign against Longstreet than it was Burnside. That's how it started. I think this is a good slide here to really look at Longstreet's plan. Initially, you look at the three levels of war, you look strategic, operational, and tactical. You look at Longstreet's operational plan. You see here the Little Tennessee, the Little River, and then on up to Knoxville, the Holston River that crosses to the south of Knoxville. Longstreet's initial plan, what he wanted to do was follow the route of Wheeler here. But unfortunately, because they had left Virginia in early September with little but what they could carry on their backs, they had all the pontoon bridges, but they had no pack animals or enough pack animals to carry all the equipment that was needed. And so he could not conduct these little miniature river crossings that he wanted to do across the Little River, across the Little Tennessee, and south of Knoxville, this route here that Wheeler was taking. So he had no choice but really to cross at Loudon through a pontoon bridge and then race on the north side of the river where the railroad is. This is the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad right here that goes down towards Cleveland, Tennessee, and then splits one to Chattanooga and one to Dalton, Georgia. And you see there's no railroad south of the river here. It was all north. So with the terrain the way it was, the geography, and with the lack of really proper equipment to cross rivers, to conduct major river crossings, really Longstreet had no choice but to cross at Loudon and then move on the north side the same side, mind you, as Ambrose Burnside and most of his forces. This is the depot at Sweetwater, Tennessee, which is just about right here, just south. It's not the original one. It was built after the war. Then, of course, here's a history on a stick sign about Longstreet's crossing here in Loudon, Tennessee. So they leave Chattanooga the first week of November from the stations there. Had roughly about 12,000 men. But there are problems with the trains right from the start that I had talked about. Moxie Sorley, who was one of Longstreet's staff officers, said the trains in operation were, quote, almost comical in their inefficiency. That they would, as they moved north and they would go uphill, the soldiers had to disembark because of the weight and march up to the top of the hill and then reboard at the very top of the hill before they would get going. They'd run out of firewood for the trains, and so they would have to disembark again and go scavenge, cut down trees to fuel the trains. Sorrell said, quote, "We were so dependent on Bragg's vision, which cruelly failed us. Not to dwell too long on these mishaps, I need only add that they beset the entire campaign." But before even Longstreet left, Braxton Bragg had deployed in mid-October Major General Carter Stevenson to the area around the Loudon area to really keep a watch on Burnside. And so when Longstreet departs and the bulk of his force arrived in Loudon around Sweetwater around the 12th of November, 64, he meets up with Carter Stevenson. He has all these supplies, and Carter Stevenson, to Longstreet's astonishment, says all these supplies gathered have been directed to head back towards Chattanooga. I have to send those back to Chattanooga, and also to resupply Lee's army as well. These were not for Longstreet and his men. And again, it's just another example, and why I think the rift between Longstreet and Bragg even grew during the campaign. You see those messages that took place on the second week of November about who was responsible for what. Very difficult. So he commences his river crossing operations at Loudon on November 14th. And on the same day that he did so, Grant, now in Chattanooga, sends a message of encouragement to Burnside, says, quote, that it is of the utmost vital importance that East Tennessee should be held. Take immediate steps to that end. Because East Tennessee was very much a pro-Union part of the nation. Very much stuck with the Union, wished not to secede when that took place. And when Burnside arrived in Knoxville in September, he was almost greeted as a liberator, as a hero. But one thing that when Grant did take command, Lincoln would always remind his commander, his rising star, to always remember Burnside. That was always a factor, even when the battles of Chattanooga took place, 23rd to the 25th of November. Lincoln was always reminding Grant to always remember Burnside up there. Well, anyway, Burnside comes down from Knoxville to around Lenore Station right here, Lenore's, and he's looking at the operational and tactical picture, and his commanders are saying, "Hey, we could defend the river, defend the river crossing, which is always very difficult." But he says, "No, I think we're just going to withdraw slowly towards Knoxville." Burnside said in his official report, he said, quote, "Knowing the purposes of General Grant as I did, I decided that I could better serve him by driving Longstreet farther away from Bragg than by checking him at the river. And I accordingly decided to withdraw my forces and retreat leisurely toward Knoxville, and soon after daylight on the 15th, the whole command was on the road." And that's what he does. But, he still clings to the, Longstreet is still kind of clinging to a south of the river type of operation, and thus he sends Joseph Wheeler on a raid. You see there, and I'll move this picture here to attack some of the heights south of Knoxville across the river. They weren't forts at that time. They were simply sort of fortified and highly defended heights. Those attacks, he captures Maryville right here, attacks the heights, but it really doesn't amount to anything. He's not successful in that mission, and he returns back to Longstreet after that takes place. So now we have the race to Campbell Station. And the Battle of Campbell Station took place on November 16th. And you recall they crossed Loudon about the 14th and 15th, so just about a day before they had crossed the river. You see the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad right here. And you see two major roads right here, the old Kingston Road or the Kingston Road, and you see Lenore Road right here. And he's got the Confederates. You have Lafayette McLaws is on the north, is on the left, marching down the Kingston Road, and Micah Jenkins is on the Lenore Road. And what Longstreet's plan is to try and trap Burnside's men right here at this intersection right here. That's his hopes. That's his hopes at least. You know, with his converging forces off both of those roads. And as he arrives, Longstreet directed that Jenkins send two brigades off to his right, Burnside's left flank, while also creating diversion on Burnside's right flank. And you can see what happens here is Burnside again, going back to what he talked about, that, you know, I see it best to really draw Longstreet away from Chattanooga. He slowly begins to move from position to position. You see here, position 3 and position 4, position 5, you know, really pulling Longstreet along with him. But the Battle of Campbell Station was, as Earl Hess, the historian, talked about, was really mostly an artillery fight. But as this progresses, and again, as Longstreet had directed Micah Jenkins to send two brigades, one of them being Evander Law and George Anderson, his two brigades, to go off and find a way to strike the flank and rear of Burnside's forces. They get disoriented by the terrain, and Law actually ends up in front of the Burnside's front lines. Jenkins is very upset. He says he wrote in his official report that I received a message from General Law that in advancing, his brigade had obliqued so much to the left as to have gotten out of its line of attack. And the attack had started so late, about 1,500 hours in the day. Jenkins wanted to continue the attack, but then darkness set in. Law is once again blamed for this lost opportunity. He was blamed at the Battle of Wauhatchie on October 29th. He caught some shrapnel for that. Long after the sounds of battle had fell silent, Longstreet still claimed that Law had, quote, robbed him of victory. Jenkins wrote, the careless and inexcusable movement by Law lost us the few moments in which success at this point could be attained. Roughly about 600 casualties on both sides. But again, mostly an artillery fight, as Burnside is you know, enticing Longstreet to continue his journey. So we have here, it was 17 miles from Campbell Station to Knoxville. And Burnside, after this little skirmish here at Campbell Station, withdraws in the night. It was a miserable, cold, rainy night for the soldiers on both sides. Bad roads. Soldiers swore that they fell asleep walking. Officers fell asleep in the saddle. A Michigan soldier recalled it was 17 of the longest, weariest miles that has ever been my misfortune to travel. But you see here, one of the commanders, Hartranft right here, Colonel Hartranft was a division commander, John Hartranft. He reached Campbell Station at that intersection right there at the opportune time. But he's also known for something else. And there's a picture of the house right here. You see here, this is that house right there to the right of the screen. That's the house in the painting that is found in the Farragut Museum on Farragut. That's the name of Campbell Station now, after damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. That gentleman there. But this gentleman here, John Hartranft, is known also. He became the commanding officer of the old Capitol Prison in Washington and special provost during the trial of the four conspirators for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And on July 7th, 1865, at 1:15 in the afternoon, it was John Hartranft who actually read aloud the orders to carry out the orders of President Lincoln for the execution of those four conspirators. Well, we saw him a couple years earlier, holding fast his defense for the Army of the Ohio against Longstreet's approaching forces at the Battle of Campbell Station. Well, here's a picture of Knoxville, Tennessee, occupied about a square mile, about 150 feet above the river. There were three creeks that intersected the city, flowing south into the Holston River, which was a tributary of the Tennessee River. And some of the Burnside's engineer officers had flooded some of those creeks, so sort of would prohibit some avenues of approach and direction of attacks by Longstreet and his men into certain areas. Site of East Tennessee University, which is now, of course, the University of Tennessee. I mentioned East Tennessee, the pro-union support. Citizens would assist Burnside with feeding his army by sending supplies down the river, down by the Holston River. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. And here's Knoxville itself. And I'll point out some of these things here. We have the Holston River here, and the gentleman who was really responsible for finishing up the defenses for Burnside was a very good, very capable, competent engineer, Captain Orlando Poe, as he established these defenses, these different forts, south and north of the river, some of the defenses, etc. He was really instrumental in making that happen. But if you ask me, my friends, Captain Orlando Poe looks very much like, well, Captain Jack Sparrow of Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, you look at that, pretty similar, I would say, in how to look there. But anyway, so Fort Sanders was a fort with thick earthen walls, 8 feet high in some places, a 12-foot wide ditch, cannons placed in the bastions projecting from the corners of the fort, enfilading the ditch. But there was a flaw, this third creek here, that possibly could be exploited by Longstreet and his attacking forces, and that's what they were looking at. Hey, maybe this is something we can take advantage of, and that's how plans begin to take shape. Alexander said this part right here, Porter Alexander, the famous artillerist, that was one point of the lines which it was possible to assault with any hope of success. Poe and his engineers had also strung telegraph wire around the stumps outside the fort to slow up the attackers. I'll show that here in a little bit. The Fort Sanders itself was manned by just under 500 soldiers, with about a dozen cannons. Burnside in Knoxville itself had about 12,000 altogether, about 50 cannons as well. But Longstreet waits the arrival of troops from Chattanooga. He planned for a straightforward assault on Fort Sanders. Alexander had brought 30-plus guns with him from Virginia, soften up the defenses around Fort Sanders. Sharpshooters would take the rifle pits outside the walls, and the infantry would then charge. But like I'd mentioned, Longstreet delays. He had asked for reinforcements, and he got 2,600 men arriving under the command of Bushrod Johnson, would arrive at some point to assist. But Longstreet's also confused with the river makeup of the city. And I will get into that here in just a little bit. This is Danville Ledbetter, who is Braxton Bragg's chief of engineer. And when the Confederates did hold Knoxville, he was sort of instrumental in putting up, starting the development of the forts that would become the defenses there in Knoxville. But he arrives on November 25th. And, Longstreet's obviously going to really pay a lot of attention to what Ledbetter has to say. And as he looks at, scans the Knoxville defenses, this is where Danville Ledbetter thinks the attack should take place, Mabry's Hill to the east. That's what he thinks. So as Porter Alexander had placed artillery positions there at Cherokee Heights and south of the river. Now he begins to formulate a plan on how to support an attack and assault on Mabry's Hill to the east. How would that take place? But a day later, on November 26th, after determining that Mabry Hill was not the best place to assault, they go back to Fort Sanders. And Longstreet and his staff see a U.S. soldier walk across the ditch, unaware that the soldier is walking on a plank. And Longstreet and his senior commanders wrongly assume that the ditch is really not that deep, that it can be overcome very easily. And of course, you see some of the other forts here. And again, those are heights here. And this is the key slide, folks, I want you to really hone in on. This is Oliver Temple's East Tennessee in the Civil War. You see this hill to the right. This is the French Broad River, French Broad. The Longstreet had acquired some rudimentary maps when he left Chattanooga. And there were some Confederate sympathizers in the Knoxville area, and they went to Longstreet's headquarters. And you see this line here. These are Confederate, outposts, to try and encircle Burnside's force. But Longstreet thinks the French Broad River is actually the Little River. He thinks this does not exist. And these Confederate sympathizers go to his headquarters and say, "Sir, you do not have Burnside encircled. He is able to take supplies and take them down the river on the Holston from the French Broad to the Holston because you do not have that secure." Longstreet did not pay attention to him. He did not heed their advice. He did not heed the intelligence they were providing him. He was steadfast in his knowledge and information and awareness that the French Broad was not there, but was right here. I think that's probably a pretty tactical, serious error on his part. Could have made a difference because Burnside had placed a boom across the Holston River here to catch the supplies that those sympathetic to his cause were floating down the river. So supplies somewhat were able to be gathered by Burnside's men in the Army of Ohio. Colonel William Sanders was an energetic and respected cavalry officer. He was able to delay Longstreet's advance in Knoxville just in time for Burnside and Orlando Poe to finish up their defenses. Now, Burnside had arrived in Knoxville on November 17th. You remember the Battle of Campbell Station occurred the day before. Holds a meeting with his commanders at night and asks Orlando Poe, how much time do you need to really finalize and make sturdy the defenses here in Knoxville? He says, one day. And so Burnside turns to Sanders and says, can you delay for one more day to allow the engineers to finish? And Sanders nods his head. Yes, I can do that. Burnside's, again, very much respects Sanders and his competency and his diligence to duty. And he says, and very good. And the meeting is dismissed. And that's what happens. Sanders goes out south of on the approaches of where Longstreet's coming up and delays Longstreet just enough for Poe to finish his defenses. But unfortunately, he loses his life in that endeavor. This is the Bleak House, which is now the Confederate Memorial Hall, just on the outskirts of Knoxville. And there in the cupola, you see right here, you can see the attic or the cupola, were Confederate sharpshooters that had been placed there, and were pinging Sanders's force that was in defense, just not too far off. And one of the snipers takes a shot at William Sanders and strikes and hits him. And he falls. He actually dies the next day, about the same time that Lincoln was given his Gettysburg Address. And so the Union reaction to that, they tell one of the commanders, Samuel Benjamin, who was an artillery commander, to take out the cupola here, the attic, and fires one shot, a Parrott shot, and that's exactly what they do. They take out those Confederate sniper positions, and this is a picture I took from inside that cupola, and you can see here where the Parrott struck right there. And if you ever visit Knoxville, I definitely recommend going to Confederate Memorial Hall. This right here is a pencil drawing of 3 Confederate soldiers that were drawn during their time when they were up here in this position. I think 1 or 2 of them may have lost their life because of that artillery round that came in and impacted their position. And there are blood stains on the floor, etc. But it's a really neat place to visit. But that was right there. That's where that took place, and you see here. There we go. That's the death of William Sanders. That's just not far from Bleak Hall, from the Memorial Hall where the snipers were. But General Sanders is buried at the Chattanooga National Military Cemetery here, of course, and that's his final resting place. When informed that he was dying, Sanders said, quote, "Well, I am not afraid to die. I've made up my mind upon that subject. I've done my duty and have served my country as well as I could." A witness to his last moments said Sanders was grateful that he was not shot in the back. Passes away. And folks, here are 3 images of Fort Sanders itself. And you can see here, this is probably the best picture of these tree stumps, 1 to 2 feet high, that Poe had, his engineers had placed telegraph wire from stump to stump to try and trip up any attacking force. And you see that ditch, that's rather a formidable obstacle for sure. Well, it rained all day on the 28th of November. And again, there have been delays, forces coming from Chattanooga and Danville Ledbetter coming in as well. Missionary Ridge had been assaulted on the 25th of November. Bragg and the Army of Tennessee had withdrawn to Dalton, Georgia to the south. And some Confederate commanders began to get a little bit leery about, should we even attack at all? Should we maybe return even back to Virginia because of rumblings they're hearing about a defeat of Bragg in Chattanooga? Longstreet really confesses, "We cannot leave Bragg on his own." Quote, "There is neither safety nor honor in any other course." But again, the use of Alexander's artillery. Initially, the plan was to really bombard the salient, the fort, with just a massive bombardment of cannons and mortars. But Longstreet changes his plan. Gone was a strong softening up of the forces there, but it now would be simply an attack at dawn, really without any artillery barrage at all, almost a signaling, a signal for the infantry to advance. Alexander was incredulous; he couldn't believe it. Well, the night before, Micah Jenkins, division commander, talked with McClaw and Alexander that ladders might be needed for the assault. He had spoken with Confederates who had been in Knoxville when they were putting defenses up and beginning to develop them. And they told him about the ditch and some of the obstacles they would face, and Jenkins was a little bit worried. He goes to McClaw's, and McClaw just says, "We'll do the best we can." Alexander kind of dismisses him and say, talk to Longstreet. And he writes a note to Longstreet, sort of expressing his views and his concerns. And this is what Longstreet writes back to him: "If we go with the idea that we shall fail, we will be sure to do so. But no men who are determined to succeed can fail. Let me urge you not to entertain such feelings for a moment. Do not entertain such feelings. Do not let anyone fail or anything." Under the overall command of General Edward Ferrero, soldiers of the 79th Infantry, New York Infantry, 2nd and 20th Michigan, 29th Massachusetts, took up the defenses of Fort Sanders. One Confederate soldier described it, quote, "It was surrounded by a deep and wide moat, from the bottom of which to the top of the fort was from 18 to 20 feet. In front of the moat for several hundred yards was felled timber, which formed an almost impassable abattis, while wire netting was stretched from stump to stump and around the fort. At 11 p.m. on the 28th, Confederate skirmishers advanced and began to clear away some of the outposts around Fort Sanders. It's cold and wet. The walls, forts were frozen. The attack begins. And here we go. Had to wade through a waist-deep creek. You can see the lines of attack here. The forces here, and they almost begin to converge almost because of the terrain. Essentially a bayonet charge. Longstreet had directed soldiers not to fire their weapons until they actually get up to the fort itself. 3 brigades from McLaws Division, 1 brigade to support Jenkins and Bushrod Johnson as well, about 4,000 men, 61% of his infantry. And what happens? They get stuck in that ditch. They get stuck in the ditch that we just looked at right there. Lieutenant Samuel Benjamin, who controlled the artillery inside the fort, 2nd U.S. Artillery, had prepared 50 cannon shells with 3-second fuses they would use as hand grenades. So he's tossing these shells down into the ditch, hand grenades for the most part. Even used Roman candles to light up the sky. The attack lasted 30 minutes. One Northern correspondent wrote, "The earth was saturated with blood. Men waded in blood, struggled up the slopes, and slipping in blood fell back to join their mangled predecessors in the gory mud below. The groans of the dying and shrieks of the wounded arose above the din of the cannon." 3 Confederate flags did make it to the top of the parapets, the 13th and 17th Mississippi and 16th Georgia, but that was as far as they got. One soldier, the 79th New York Infantry inside the fort, said there was no need to take careful aim. The brave rebels crowded up to the ditch as the first line had done, and almost every bullet fired by us found a death mark. Shells were bursting in the ditch and tearing the poor fellows' limbs, limb to limb, scattering fragments far and near. Casualties, 800 plus casualties for the Confederates. The U.S. forces, 13. 13 casualties, 8 dead and 5 wounded. One officer of 36 Massachusetts said it was Fredericksburg in reverse. Burnside asked for a truce to collect the wounded, and that was granted. Dead Confederates were stiff, stacked up against the bastion walls. By that time, Longstreet gets wind that Sherman may be en route to Knoxville, hears about what has happened in Chattanooga, and begins to think about withdrawing from Knoxville. He said, quote, "The confidence in the conduct of the war was broken." And 1 hour after the repulse, which again took place at dawn, he hears of Bragg's defeat. He initially makes plan to join Bragg in Dalton, Georgia, but he quickly realizes that is not a good idea. And here's from Harper's Weekly, a picture of that. Interestingly enough, one of Longstreet's artillery commanders who took place in the Knoxville attack and would lob artillery into Knoxville itself was one of his, again, artillery commander. There was an individual named Lieutenant Colonel Peyton Manning of the Confederacy. How ironic, of course, with Peyton Manning, University of Tennessee, and there's no connection between the two, at least what I can find, but that Peyton Manning was actually part of the Confederate force there. Dennis Hart Mahan, who taught at West Point for almost 50 years, wrote this about attacking such field fortifications. You see here, demonstrations should be made at various points to really divert attention from the real true attack. The use of scaling ladders, other means to ascend the parapets. These are things that were not considered, taken into account, and were not applied. In mid-December 1863, General Longstreet places Lafayette McLaws under arrest, grounds for court-martial, and these are the 3 charges that you see here the Longstreet proffered against the McLaws. Those in red just highlight really the specific charges against Lafayette McLaws, the failure of the sharpshooters, really failure to really make a specific instruction for how to lead the assault, and of course the big one here, failing to provide his assaulting columns with ladders or other means. Delays occurred during this court-martial. Court-martial convenes on February 12th, 64, but it's delayed once again because of operations in the second week of March. The court adjourns, and once it does finally get underway, McLaws is acquitted on the first 2 charges. failure to employ sharpshooters and not advancing according to instructions. But he's guilty of the third. Suspended verdict is 60 days without command or without pay or rank. The Adjutant General of the Confederacy, Samuel Cooper, overturns the verdict and restores McLaws to command. But in May of '64, he's reassigned out of the Army of Northern Virginia, out of Longstreet's command, and assigned to the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So he is out of Lee's army. McLaws wrote Bragg, says, "I honestly think that the interest of the country demands that the cause of failure of this campaign should be known." And by that time, Bragg had left the Army of Tennessee. He would eventually become, in a couple of months, Jeff Davis's senior military advisor before Lee takes over. July of 1873, Longstreet writes McLaws. This is 8 years after the war, and feels that he had, quote, relieved McLaws, quote, in an unguarded moment. Time healed the branch of the two men, but I don't think McLaws ever really fully forgave Longstreet. Evander Law. On December 19th, Evander Law submits his resignation and hopes to join the cavalry. Longstreet really saw this as an opportunity to get rid of Law as well, because remember he had some hiccups, some doubts there at the Battle of Wauhatchie in October of '63, and then a month later at the Battle of Campbell Station. Both Micah Jenkins and James Longstreet really came down hard on Law. Well, Longstreet grants this request for Law to go to Richmond and present his paperwork to authorities in person. So he's gone. The favor cheerfully granted, as Longstreet put it. So Law runs into John Boy Hood in Richmond, again recuperating from his wounds from Chickamauga, who takes the resignation of the paperwork to James Seaton, who's the Secretary of War. Now Hood convinces Law not to resign his commission and not to pursue this course. And he convinces Law to do that. And Law concurs, says, okay, roger that. So he destroys the letter. And so Law believes he did not formally submit the paperwork, and he gets on a train and heads back to East Tennessee to resume command. So meanwhile, as the soap opera continues, Longstreet hears rumors from Law's officers that they are circulating a petition to do recruiting duty in their native state. Law sees this as simply a means to get out of hazardous duty. Longstreet does. And Longstreet is furious. When Law arrives back in East Tennessee, he arrests Law for conduct highly prejudicial to good order and discipline, military discipline. And a couple weeks later, he tacks on another charge for Law destroying the paperwork that he wrote his resignation on. One of Law's counselors was William Oates, who commanded the 15th Alabama at the Battle of Little Round Top, the charge of Little Round Top. He was one of Law's counselors. He said the effort to punish the men of that brigade to gratify Longstreet's malice against Law and his commanders was too small for a man of Longstreet's position to stoop to perform. But he was brimful of malice. Let me go back one, I'm sorry. So on April 8th, and Richmond is up in arms now because they've had to deal with McLaws and now Evander Law's position. On April 18th, Samuel Cooper orders Law relief from arrest and placed back in command. Robert Lee gets involved in this situation, and Lee informs Longstreet that Davis had, quote, declined to entertain the charges. So what does Longstreet do? He rearrests Law one more time, again, a second time, and they've had it. Longstreet writes to Lee on April 27th, two courses of action: either Law goes or I go. And so, of course, Lee needs Longstreet back in his command on April 30th. He recommends that Law be relieved of command until further investigation. But it's really all a moot point, my friends, because Longstreet's wounded on May 6th at the Battle of the Wilderness, and Law ends up is wounded at the Battle of Cold Harbor, and actually does get his request to join the cavalry, and he is with Joseph Johnston's command there in the Carolinas when the war ends. And folks, so for brevity, I'm going to kind of go through these next slides here rather quickly. And you see here, of course, Knoxville, you see Bristol, Tennessee up in this area, and you see some of the engagements that also took place in East Tennessee, very minor skirmishes, Bean Station, Mossy Creek, Dandridge, Fair Garden. This was his winter headquarters right here, Russellville. And I will show that to you right now. That's Longstreet's headquarters as he left Knoxville on the cold evening of December 4th. December 10th, he's given departmental command of all forces in East Tennessee. But this is where he would reside for about almost 2 months, and is also where he penned his resignation at the end of December. I think it demonstrates the loneliness of command, the stresses of command that he was experiencing at the time, and of course, the authorities in Richmond denied it. You said just carry on, but he would be at this place right here. This is open for business for tours. It would serve as his headquarters until February 26th. Again, for brevity, folks, I'm going to just pass through these rather quick. This is the battle. This is Bean Station. Mostly, it was kind of a cavalry action, I guess, to some extent. This is a tavern here that is now underwater. That's why I show the water here, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So, but again, this was another opportunity that was lost for Longstreet. Some of his commanders did not operate as effectively as he would have liked, and again, I think it goes to show his disappointment in some of his commanders. Jerome Robertson, for one, that I'll talk about here in just a minute, but it certainly did not turn out to be the type of battle that he wanted to see, which is most against Union cavalry. Mossy Creek, the same, really the same instance, mostly cavalry fight as Union forces try and approach Longstreet's headquarters there that I showed you in Russellville. The house here to the right is the Fairview home, which was built in 1850, and there are damaged parts of it that's still there. The Arrow Hill Mansion here to the left also has been around for quite a while, and Harrison Ford, his parents celebrated their 60th anniversary here, right here in this house. Battle of Dandridge on January 17th. Again, another attempt by the U.S. forces to secure some of the rich forage grounds that was near Dandridge in the area by the river. And again, for brevity, I'm just going to move on from here. This right here, if you heard of Emerson Opdyke in the 125th Ohio, they participated in the Battle of Dandridge. And what I'm highlighting here, this is a swale that they got stuck in as the Confederates were approaching, and they were not able to extract themselves from the swale until after dark. And this is a parlor that Longstreet and some of his staff officers gathered during the time of the battle. So on February 20th, Jeff Davis had sent a request for additional cavalry elements to leave Longstreet's command and hook up with Joseph Johnston, who is now commanding the Army of Tennessee. Longstreet, of course, obliged to that, and Davis also said, "Hey, no more going after Knoxville. I think we're done." And so at that point, Longstreet determined it was best to go to Greenville, Tennessee, to his new headquarters. Greenville, Tennessee is the second oldest town in Tennessee, home of Andrew Johnson, President Andrew Johnson. This is the Dixon Williams Mansion. Guests of the home here were Marquis de Lafayette, three U.S. presidents. And in February of 1864, Longstreet had made his headquarters in another part of this town. But this mansion also is the place where John Hunt Morgan was killed in September of 1864, I think here. And he escaped, left the house, went to the basement of this home here, and then right outside the mansion, this is where he fell. I believe Morgan is buried somewhere, I think in Lexington, Kentucky, I believe. But Thunderbolt of the Confederacy, that's where he spent his last days. I mentioned Jerome Robertson, folks. He had problems with the entire campaign from the start. He complained about the campaign lack of food and shoes, which was a serious impediment to Longstreet's command during the time. But he would state at the Battle of Bean Station, December, that I need written orders only. He was very recalcitrant towards Jenkins, and when the fighting ended, Jenkins had had enough and removed him from command. The same court martial that saw Lafayette McLaws heard Robertson's case as well. There's no written record of the proceedings against Robertson. I think at that point the authorities in Richmond were pretty much fed up. But in June he assumed command of the Texas State Reserve Forces. So he too was gone out of Longstreet's command in the Army of Northern Virginia. And of course, on April 27th, we have a command review of the Army of Northern Virginia before the Overland Campaign takes place. And participating in that command review is James Longstreet and his men that have come out of East Tennessee and the long, arduous campaign in North Georgia and in Tennessee, and they have rejoined Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in time for that command. But just about a week plus later, Longstreet is wounded on May 6th at the Battle of the Wilderness. Micah Jenkins is killed, and Charles Field would eventually command Hood's division and leads it all the way through Appomattox. Joseph Kershaw would take McLaws' division. William Perry would lead Law's brigade, and John Gregg would lead Hood's brigade. And so we certainly have definitely some transition in the command structures there. But in closing, folks, again, 3 takeaways, and I will be very quick with this. Leadership climate is important. Command challenges were certainly there. The weather impacted the decision-making process, transportation assets, supply assets. Some of the struggles that Longstreet had with some of his subordinate commanders were certainly up there. Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Effective People, talk about how a leader must first be understood. Clear intent and purposes up and down the chain of command. And we saw this certainly disturbed in many forms and fashions during Longstreet's time in East Tennessee. The struggle for who would command Hood's division, McLaws and Longstreet going at it, very challenging indeed. The redemption of Ambrose Burnside. And I hope you get a sense that Burnside did a pretty good job against Longstreet and what he intended to do. Again, he received accolades from both houses of Congress, which was a rarity during the Civil War. He actually left command about the second week of December because of illness. A guy named John Foster took his place until replaced by John Schofield in February of '64. And again, the environment matters. I think we've kind of talked about that. Folks, as I took pictures for the book that I wrote, this is probably my favorite picture of them all. It's called the National Campground. It's outside Knoxville, and it was dedicated in 1873, put together, and the purpose behind that was a reconciliation effort by former Confederates and people of East Tennessee, those who were sympathetic to the Union cause, to U.S. cause. And it was built primarily, specifically, to unite the differences that they had. And you look at the strife that we certainly have in our country today, politically. And I'd like to hope and think that if the people in East Tennessee, North or South, if they could come together like they did after the war. And this is actually, they hold services there every September of every year, had since. I think it's a great demonstration that if these two sides had blooded each other for just a few years during a bloody civil war, if they can come together after the war for reconciliation and to come together, I think I'd like to hope that we can do the same as well. And folks, this is my book, Find Opportunity Lost. It covers what I have talked about. It's available on Amazon, and certainly welcome autographed copies as well if you're so interested. I thank you for your kind attention. I know I kind of went a little longer than I had thought. I had hoped so. So forgive me for that, but I will turn it over to Kelly and for questions here.
Thank you so much. A lot of great information, and certainly too much to cover in the short amount of time that we gave you. So I encourage people to buy the book. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it through Savas Beatty. You can get it through our shop as well. And if you're a member, remember you get 10% off on purchases. We do have some questions, and I think the first one that was thrown out here by Niles is or Nils rather, is a good one. He says, why do you think Longstreet was more successful as a corps commander than leading an independent campaign? And then on the flip side of that, why was Burnside more successful leading the Army of the Ohio in East Tennessee than leading the Army of the Potomac in
Great question,
Virginia?
Jeff. And one of the things that I've not yet, I've been trying to verify is when Longstreet came back to Lee's army, end of April, one of his staff officers is supposedly have heard Longstreet say, "I'm glad to be back under the shadow, under the umbrella of Robert E. Lee." Sort of gives gives evidence maybe that the independent command was something he may have wanted, but maybe turned out to be less than it was. And I think the challenge that he had in East Tennessee was manyfold for sure. I think with the Army of Tennessee leadership, the campaign getting off to a very rough start in terms of the supply and logistics was a big, huge factor. Indeed, the foraging inabilities, the challenge, the bushwhackers, the East Tennessee bushwhackers that kind of thwarted his attempts to feed his army, feed his men, feed the horses, proved challenging indeed, debilitating almost. And I think the frustration of command is evidenced by Longstreet submitting his resignation at the end of December. The command challenges he was having that he had seen under Bragg's command, but now he himself was having to undertake and undergo and endure and to try and figure out was just I think it was just frustration had mounted. And this goes back to the Battle of Chickamauga too. The opportunity he saw that was lost after Chickamauga and into Chattanooga, I think just for frustration. I think for Burnside, I think sort of separated from the politics of Washington D.C. and the Army of the Potomac. He's sort of in Kentucky and East Tennessee, was kind of left alone on his own devices. And I think he just had a very good grasp of the tactical and operational imperatives that both Lincoln was pressing with the importance of East Tennessee to the Union. I think he was very adept and very cognizant of that fact, and recognized the importance of that politically as well as militarily. That meant to Lincoln and both to Grant, and kept constant communication with Grant during this time period. And I think Grant would say that Burnside did like the quote I had that Grant had sent Burnside, "You're doing exactly what I want you to do." So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And Clark says, excellent use of maps and explanation of geography. And it adds so much to where and why of the military movements. Did you produce the maps used in the presentation, or what source? These were outstanding along with your descriptions.
Yeah, Hal Jesperson does my maps. Did the maps for me for this book. He does a lot of Savas Beatty books, but the maps were done by him. And the book, in the book, you'll see those are the same maps that are in the book as well, and there's some others also.
Excellent. And then another question: why did Longstreet change his mind about using the artillery to soften up the Union line?
Golly, that's a great question. And like I said, Port Alexander, he has his Confederate memoirs, military memoirs, then he has his other ones about the Confederacy there. He talked about he was incredulous. That's his quote at the decision that Longstreet made to forego the softening up. And I don't even know if there's a really good answer for that. I think as a matter of fact, I think Alexander and I quoted in the book talks about he was kind of a paraphrase. He was taken with the notion of a dawn attack is the best way to attack, and that's what we're going to do. Words to that effect. That if we do a surprise attack at dawn, that it will surprise the enemy again. they were not to fire a shot as they approached. So he thought they could, you know, you know, creep up on the Union defenses, but that certainly proved not to be the case. And it just, it's kind of what ifs. What if, he allowed Alexander to just go with his 30 plus guns and mortars to soften up those defenses, and who knows what would have happened.
And kind of a follow-up to that, Niels asks, why do you think Longstreet was confident that the infantry assault would succeed, given that he had opposed the launching of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg?
There was a Confederate soldier, and I hope I get this quote right, that was part of the attack on Fort Sanders, and he said that Longstreet put his men in the same position that Lee put Longstreet in for Pickett's charge. That was his view of how the attack on Fort Sanders went. And I think it goes straight to that question too as well. There are many who say, and many will probably rightly say, that Lee was very overconfident at Gettysburg, that his Virginians could do it, and maybe to some extent these battle hardened veterans of so many battles and campaigns in the Army of Northern Virginia, that Longstreet probably, rightly so, probably had some really strong confidence in their ability to overcome the defenses and the obstacles for victory. But as George Pickett said after the Battle of Gettysburg, I think the Union had something to do with it as well.
All right. And I'm wondering, is there anything left of Fort Sanders, of the ditch that's there, or is?
No, it is all commercial development. The University of Tennessee has really eaten it up. There are some places maybe where you might see some of the bastion walls and some of the subdivisions, but you got the history on a stick. You got a monument to the 79th New York. There's just not a lot there now. The fort south of the Holston River, the Tennessee River now, Fort Dickerson is very much in good condition. And I know the city of Knoxville is working hard to really try and really beef up those other forts that existed. There were 4 forts there to build them up and restore them maybe to some degree of what they would look like during the Civil War. But again, commercial development is very hard.
Well, that's a shame.
Yeah.
And Emily says, excellent presentation with terrific maps, photos, and quotes. Thank you. And then also comments, poignant closing photo and lovely statement on reconciliation now and then. Yeah. So I think that's a great way to end.
I think I saw something.
Yes.
Some question about state affiliation or something.
Let's see. Did I miss that one? Because there was one that just came in, another one from Niels. If Longstreet had not embarked on the Knoxville campaign, do you think it might have altered the outcome of the Battle of Chattanooga?
Well, I would just say what Grant said in his memoirs, that said that if Longstreet had, say, for example, and going into what ifs here, kind of factual, say Longstreet defeats Burnside at Campbell Station, destroys him. Grant in his memoirs, and I'll paraphrase here, said if that would have taken place and Longstreet returned back to Chattanooga, we basically would have left Chattanooga and words of that, we would have been lucky to have gotten out of that city alive. And so you think about if Chattanooga does not fall, in fact, the Confederacy perhaps regains Chattanooga and Grant's forces have to withdraw, say, back towards Nashville and their supply base. Does Grant star dim in Lincoln's eyes? Where does Sherman begin his march to Atlanta? It's certainly not Dalton, Georgia. Is it Nashville? And if that doesn't take place to September, and does Atlanta fall in September of '64? And if Atlanta does not fall, is Lincoln reelected? So there's a lot of what ifs. But I think Grant said it best. He said if Longstreet had come back, I think it would have been it could have been a different story altogether for the battles of Chattanooga that took place on 23rd to the 25th of September.
And I found the state affiliation question. Because Longstreet did not have a state affiliation, do you think that influenced his broader strategic view of the Confederate war effort, whereas Lee's strategy was focused on Virginia?
Well, I've done a lot of research on this, and I think that the biggest thing it may not get into his broader strategic view of the war effort, but it certainly gets into
Mm,
post-war activities, because without that state affiliation, I mean, he is, as probably many of you know, he is attacked quite harshly after Lee dies in October of 1870 by Jubal Early and William Pendleton. We get the fall sunrise order at Gettysburg, and and they just blame him for the loss of Gettysburg. Uh, becomes a Republican. He goes to New Orleans, and he works with black militias, uh, militia forces down there. He's a supporter of Grant, so he does a lot of things. But I think a lot of things that took off a lot of the old antebellum type philosophy and theories and of the old South and supported Reconstruction. And a lot of those things just did not bode well with the southern states. And because I think of that lack of state affiliation, he didn't have a Virginia like Lee did or Jackson. He was born in South Carolina, raised in Georgia, got his West Point appointment through Alabama. So, there
mm,
was not a state that really embraced him like post-war, like a lot of states did. And so you do not see a lot of Longstreet statues anywhere. After during this period, you see that you see one there in Gettysburg, of course. But I think that lack of state affiliation really had an impact, really more in post-war efforts, but also Longstreet's kind of thinking and some of his decisions and actions and words, both orally and in writing, that really kind of put him aside. But I think his reputation is coming back. I think going to an earlier question, I think as a corps commander, he was certainly dead to rights. Second Manassas, for example, he was a rock, he was a hammer. His organization and not being fully prepared to went to assault. But the lost causers, they would pick and they would pick on that, and his reputation was tarnished. But I think in the last decade or so, it's been coming back.
all right, excellent, excellent answer there, and excellent presentation tonight. Lots of good information. So once again, think about purchasing that book. And I want to thank you so much, Colonel Lowe, for doing this talk for us tonight. I want to thank all of you who logged in, especially our members, because it is really through your support that we are able to do the work that we do, increasing the public's understanding of the American Civil War. So thank you all, and everyone have a good night and a great weekend.